The reservation had been made 3 weeks in advance. Table 12, private corner. Chicago's most exclusive hotel restaurant, where the menu had no prices and the lighting was dim enough to make everyone look important. Emily had worked the Saturday night shift here for 2 years, and she knew exactly what kind of table this was before she even walked over. Old money, complicated energy, the kind of family that smiled too wide and talked too carefully. She smoothed her apron, picked up her notepad, and headed over. There were 8 of them seated around the long, oval table, all dressed like they'd stepped out of a magazine spread. The men wore dark suits without ties. The women had jewelry that caught the light in ways that made Emily feel slightly underdressed just looking at it. At the head of the table sat a man who looked to be in his early 30s, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the kind of stillness that made people notice him without him doing anything at all. He wasn't loud. He wasn't trying. He simply sat there, and somehow that made him the center of everything. Emily would learn his name was Ethan Russo, but before she reached the table, something else caught her attention. Seated to Ethan's left was an older woman, silver-haired, elegantly dressed in deep blue, with warm brown eyes that seemed to be doing all the talking her mouth couldn't. Her hands were moving, slowly at first, then with more urgency. She was signing something, gesturing toward the breadbasket, then toward one of the younger women across the table. Nobody was looking at her. The conversations happening around the table had already split into 3 separate threads. Someone was talking about a property deal. Someone else was laughing at something on their phone. The younger woman the older woman had been trying to reach was now turned completely sideways, deep in conversation with the man beside her. Emily stopped walking. She watched for a moment longer, just to be sure she was reading the situation correctly. The older woman's expression hadn't become frustrated or dramatic. It stayed calm, patient. The kind of patience that comes from years of practice, not from being okay with being ignored. She simply lowered her hands into her lap and looked down at her plate. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. She walked to the table, greeted everyone professionally, introduced herself, and began taking drink orders. When she reached the older woman, she paused, made gentle eye contact, and signed quietly, her hands low, close to her notepad so it wouldn't draw attention. "Can I get you something to drink?" The older woman's eyes went wide. Not dramatically, just enough. Like a small light had switched on behind them. Her hands came back up immediately. "Water, please. And you sign?" "I do," Emily signed back. "My younger sister is deaf. I've signed my whole life." The older woman's expression shifted into something Emily hadn't expected. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something closer to relief, like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally been allowed to set it down, just for a moment. Emily finished taking the remaining drink orders and went to put them in. When she came back, something at the table had shifted. The older woman's hands were moving again, more confidently this time, and she was looking directly at Emily. Emily set the drinks down one by one, and when she reached the older woman's water glass, she stayed a half step longer than necessary. The older woman signed slowly and clearly. Emily read it once, then again. She almost didn't say anything. It wasn't her place. She was a waitress. She was there to take orders, fill glasses, and stay out of whatever was happening between these people. But the woman signed it a third time, looking at Emily steadily, and there was something in her expression that made it clear she wasn't just sharing an observation. She was asking Emily to pass it along. Emily set down the last glass, straightened up, and looked at Ethan. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice quiet and even. "Your mother has been trying to get the table's attention. She asked me to share something." Every conversation stopped. Ethan looked up from the document he'd been glancing at under the table. He looked at his mother first, then at Emily, and his expression moved through several things very quickly. Surprise, curiosity, and something that might have been embarrassment. "She signs," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I do," Emily said. "She just told me something, and I think you'd want to hear it." The table had gone completely quiet now. 8 people looking at her. Emily kept her voice level. "She said, Nobody in this family is angry with each other for the reason they think they are. Silence. Not the polite kind. The kind where people are actually processing something. A woman across the table, late 20s, sharp eyes, let out a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. A man beside Ethan shifted in his chair. Someone picked up their water glass and put it back down without drinking. Ethan looked at his mother for a long moment. Margaret held his gaze, calm and steady, like she'd been waiting years for exactly this. "What else has she been saying?" Ethan asked Emily. His voice was quieter than before. Emily looked at Margaret. Margaret's hands began to move again, slowly and deliberately, like someone who suddenly had the floor after a very long wait. Emily pulled out her notepad, not to write anything down, but just to have something to hold. "She says she'd like to talk now," Emily said, "if everyone's willing to listen." Nobody at the table said a word, and somehow, that was the beginning of everything. The invitation came on a Tuesday. Emily was halfway through a double shift when one of the restaurant managers found her during a quiet moment between tables and handed her a small, cream-colored envelope with her name written on the front in neat, careful handwriting. Inside was a single card, thick paper, no printed letterhead, just a handwritten note. "Emily, I would like your help this weekend at our lake house in Wisconsin. My family needs someone who can hear me. I hope you'll come. Margaret Russo." There was a phone number at the bottom. Ethan's, as it turned out. She almost didn't call. She stood in the staff room for a good 10 minutes, turning the card over in her hands, running through every reasonable reason to politely decline. She was a waitress, not a family therapist. She didn't know these people. Whatever had happened at that dinner table last Saturday was probably better left as a one-time moment that everyone would process privately and move on from. But she kept thinking about the look on Margaret's face when Emily had signed those first words to her, that small, quiet relief. And she called. The lake house was not what Emily had pictured when she heard the words lake house. It was a 2-story cedar structure sitting at the edge of a private lake, surrounded by tall pines that cut the September wind. There were kayaks stacked neatly beside the dock, a stone fire pit, a screened porch running the full length of the back of the house. It was beautiful in the specific way that things are beautiful when money and good taste happen to agree with each other. Ethan met her in the driveway when she arrived Friday evening. He was dressed casually, dark jeans, a gray sweater, and he looked slightly less intimidating than he had at the restaurant, though not by much. "Thank you for coming," he said, and he meant it. She could tell the difference. "Your mother's invitation was hard to say no to," Emily said honestly. Something shifted briefly in his expression. "She has that effect." Margaret was inside, already seated at the large dining table with 3 photo albums open in front of her. She looked up when Emily walked in and immediately began signing. "You came. Good. We have a lot of ground to cover." Emily laughed before she could stop herself. Margaret's timing was perfect. By Saturday morning, most of the family had arrived. Ryan, Ethan's younger brother, came with his wife, Cara. 2 cousins, a family friend who'd known the Russos for decades, and Ethan's aunt completed the group. The energy was polite, but careful, the way it tends to be when people who have history with each other are all trying not to be the one who starts something. Margaret had a plan. She'd arranged the old photo albums on the living room table, and through Emily, explained that she wanted everyone to sit together and simply share memories connected to the photos. No agenda, no formal discussion. Just stories. The family exchanged glances that said they thought this was slightly odd, but were willing to go along with it. It started slowly. Someone pointed to a photo of a summer barbecue from the early 90s. Someone else remembered the same day differently. Laughter came in small bursts. Cara, who had only married into the family 4 years ago, asked questions that made the others explain things they'd assumed everyone already knew.
And then Ryan picked up one of the albums and stopped at a particular page. It was a photo of him and Ethan at a Little League game. Ryan looked about 9, Ethan looked 13, standing behind his brother with his hand on Ryan's shoulder. Both of them were grinning. Ryan stared at it for a moment without saying anything. "I remember this day completely wrong," he said finally. Everyone looked at him. "I always thought you didn't come to this game," he said, looking at Ethan. "I told myself that for years, that you never showed up to anything I cared about when we were kids. That photo's been sitting in this album and I never—" He stopped, shook his head. "When did you get there?" "Before the first inning," Ethan said. He wasn't defensive about it, just factual. "I took the bus from school. You struck out twice, and then hit a double in the 5th. You were furious at yourself the whole ride home." Ryan looked at the photo again, then back at his brother. "Why did I think you weren't there?" "Because I left early," Ethan said. "Dad called. There was something with the business. I didn't tell you I was leaving because I didn't want to make a whole thing out of it. I just went." The room was quiet. Margaret's hands moved, and Emily translated. "She says this is the pattern, not just between the two of you. Someone leaves without explaining. Someone else fills in the reason themselves. And then they carry that reason for 20 years. Ryan set the album down carefully on the coffee table. It wasn't a dramatic moment. Nobody cried. Nobody made a speech. But something in the room changed. Like a window had been cracked open, and some of the stale air had finally gotten out. For the rest of the afternoon, the albums moved around the table slowly, stories following stories, some funny, and some surprisingly raw. Margaret watched all of it from her chair, with an expression Emily was beginning to recognize. Quiet and steady, like someone who had been keeping careful watch over something precious for a very long time, and was only now letting others see what she saw. By the time the sun dropped behind the pine trees and someone started a fire in the pit outside, Ryan and Ethan were sitting beside each other on the porch steps. Not talking much, just sitting. Margaret signed something to Emily from across the room. That's enough for today. The storage boxes had been in Margaret's basement for 11 years. Emily learned this on a quiet Sunday morning, 3 weeks after the lake house weekend, when Margaret called Ethan's phone, her preferred method of reaching people since she couldn't make calls herself, and asked if Emily might be available to help with some organizing.
Ethan passed the message along with a look that suggested he found the whole arrangement both slightly unusual and entirely unsurprising where his mother was concerned. Emily drove out to the Chicago suburbs on a grey October morning with a coffee she picked up on the way and no real idea what she was walking into. Margaret met her at the door, dressed practically, dark slacks, a simple blouse, her silver hair pulled back. She signed a greeting, gestured Emily inside, and led her straight through the house and down to the basement without any preamble. The basement was clean and organized, which made the corner with the boxes stand out. There were 14 of them, stacked carefully, each one sealed with tape that had yellowed at the edges. Margaret pointed at them and signed. "Those are mine. I need someone I trust to help me go through them." Emily looked at the boxes, then at Margaret. "What's in them?" Margaret's answer was simple. Time. They started with the top boxes, which turned out to be mostly practical things: old financial records, holiday decorations wrapped in newspaper. A set of china that Margaret signed had belonged to her own mother. Emily carried, sorted, and stacked, while Margaret directed, and for the first hour it was straightforward and almost meditative. Then Emily opened a box near the bottom of the third stack and found the letters. There were dozens of them, maybe more. Each one handwritten on plain white paper, folded in thirds, with a name written on the outside in the same careful handwriting Emily recognized from the lake house invitation. Ethan, Ryan, a name she didn't recognize, Daniel, several with no name at all. She held one up carefully, not opening it, and looked at Margaret. Margaret went still for a moment. Then she crossed the basement slowly and sat down on a wooden stool beside the shelving unit. She looked at the box of letters for a long moment before her hands began to move. I wrote them when I couldn't say things out loud. After the accident that took my voice, there were years where I had no way to make anyone slow down long enough to understand me. So I wrote instead. Emily waited. I wrote to each of them when I was proud of them and couldn't get the words across. When I disagreed with a decision and nobody asked. When I watched them hurting each other and saw exactly why, but had no way to explain it. I wrote everything I couldn't find a way to sign fast enough or clearly enough for anyone to wait through. Did you ever give any of them to anyone? Emily signed. Margaret looked at the box. 3. In 20 years, I delivered 3. The basement was very quiet. Emily set the letter she was holding back into the box carefully. She didn't push. She just waited, the way she'd learned to do with Margaret. Give the silence its space and let her fill it when she was ready. Margaret reached into the box and picked up an envelope with Ethan's name on the front. She turned it over once, then held it out to Emily. It's time, she signed. All of them. I want everyone to read what I wrote. That evening, Margaret called Ethan through the usual arrangement, and Emily explained what they'd found and what Margaret wanted to do. There was a long pause on the other end of the phone before Ethan said he'd gather everyone that week. He did. 4 days later, the family sat in the living room of Margaret's home. Ethan, Ryan, Cara, the aunt whose name was Patricia, and the cousin, James. And Margaret sat in the armchair at the center of the room with the box of letters on the table beside her. Emily sat nearby, present but quiet, only there to interpret if needed. Margaret handed out the letters herself, one by one, walking the room slowly, placing each envelope into the right hands. Some people got 1 letter. Ethan got 4. Ryan got 3. Patricia received 2 and immediately pressed them against her chest without opening them, her eyes already bright. Then Margaret sat back down and signed to Emily. Tell them they can read now. The room went silent in a way that felt different from other silences. People opened envelopes carefully, like they were handling something that might not survive rough handling. Pages unfolded. Eyes moved across handwriting that was precise and unhurried. Ryan made a sound after about 2 minutes, a short exhale through his nose, and put his letter down in his lap and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Ethan read slowly, turning pages without looking up. When he finished, he set the letters on his knee, very still, and looked at his mother across the room. Margaret looked back at him steadily. He had 4 letters from her, years of her watching him, worrying about him, being proud of him in ways he'd never heard. 1 letter, dated 12 years ago, had been written the night after he'd made a business decision that the whole family had criticized. She hadn't criticized it. She'd written 3 pages about why she believed in him anyway. He hadn't known. Nobody had said anything for several minutes when Patricia finally spoke. She's been talking to us this whole time, Patricia said softly. We just never found the right way to listen. Margaret's hands moved once, and Emily translated without hesitation. She says, now you have. The retreat center was a converted farmhouse about 40 minutes outside Indianapolis. Ethan had booked it for 3 days, Thursday through Saturday, and framed it as a working retreat for the family's core business members. Strategy review, planning for the following year, the kind of thing the Russo family did periodically, usually with a great deal of tension and very little resolution. This time was different before it even started, because Margaret was coming. She'd never attended a business retreat before. In the early years after her accident, the family had quietly, collectively decided, without ever actually discussing it, that the business meetings were too fast-moving, too text-heavy, too dependent on rapid back and forth for Margaret to participate meaningfully. Nobody had said this to her face. It had simply become the arrangement, the way certain things become arrangements in families without anyone choosing them outright. Ethan had called Emily the week before and asked if she'd be willing to come as Margaret's interpreter for the 3 days. He was straightforward about it. He'd pay her fairly for her time, cover travel and accommodation, and she was free to step out of any session that felt outside the scope of what she'd signed up for. Emily had agreed, mostly because Margaret had already signed her a separate message through Ethan's phone that said simply, "Please come. They need a translator for more than just my hands." She wasn't wrong. The first session started Thursday afternoon in the farmhouse's main meeting room. A long table, windows looking out over flat Indiana farmland, a whiteboard already covered in numbers someone had written before breakfast. 6 family members were present, plus 2 senior staff who handled operations. Emily sat to Margaret's left, slightly back from the table, present enough to interpret, but out of the direct line of the business conversation. It became clear within the first 30 minutes that this particular family argument had been running for approximately 4 years. The surface issue was a proposed expansion, a new property development on the north side of Chicago that Ethan wanted to move forward on and Ryan had consistently pushed back against. The positions were well rehearsed. Ethan laid out projected returns, timelines, market conditions. Ryan countered with risk exposure, resource strain, timing concerns. The 2 senior staff watched carefully and said very little. What struck Emily, sitting slightly outside the circle of it, was how neither of them was actually wrong. She watched Margaret through the first hour. Margaret sat at the table with her hands folded, listening, watching each speaker in turn with that same careful attention she gave everything. Occasionally she'd glance at Emily with an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between patience and mild exasperation. During the coffee break, Margaret pulled Emily aside near the window. "Do you see it?" she signed. "See what?" Emily signed back. "Ethan wants to grow because he's afraid of standing still. Ryan wants to slow down because he's afraid of losing what they've already built. They've been arguing about a building. They should be talking about what they're each actually afraid of." Emily looked across the room to where Ethan was refilling his coffee and Ryan was checking his phone, neither of them speaking. "Should I say something?" Emily signed. Margaret considered for a moment. "Not yet." The afternoon session moved into financial projections and got more tense before it got better. At one point, Ryan said something sharp about decision-making patterns, and Ethan went very quiet in the particular way he went quiet when he was working to keep his response measured. The 2 staff members both found reasons to look at their documents. It was Margaret who stopped it. She tapped the table twice, just twice, firmly enough to cut through the room, and when everyone looked at her, she gestured to Emily. Emily straightened. "She wants to say something," Emily said. "She'd like everyone to listen for a few minutes without responding." Nobody argued. Margaret signed steadily, and Emily translated in real time, keeping her voice even and her pace matched to Margaret's hands. "She says she's watched this business since before either of her sons was old enough to understand what it was. She watched her husband build it, and she watched both of you grow into it. She says the argument you've been having for 4 years is not about the North Side property. It's about the fact that neither of you has ever told the other what you're actually trying to protect." The room was still. She's asking Ethan directly, "What are you afraid of?" Ethan looked at his mother. A long moment passed. "Becoming irrelevant," he said finally, quietly. "The market moves, and if we don't move with it, we lose ground we can't get back." Margaret nodded once and looked at Ryan. Emily didn't need to relay the question. Ryan had heard it. "Losing what Dad built," Ryan said. His voice was controlled, but not entirely. "Every time we expand fast, it feels like we're one bad decision away from undoing 20 years of work. I can't. I don't want to be the one who let that happen." The room held that for a moment. Margaret signed again. She says you both want the same thing. You want the business to survive and mean something. You've just been so busy defending your own position that you forgot to tell each other that. Patricia, who had been quiet in the corner with her notepad, set her pen down. One of the senior staff, a careful, measured man named Gerald, who had worked with the Russo family for over a decade, cleared his throat gently and said, "That's the most useful thing anyone said in 4 years of these meetings." Nobody laughed, but the tension in the room dropped noticeably. By Friday evening, the North Side project had a revised plan that incorporated Ryan's risk concerns into Ethan's timeline. It wasn't the plan either of them had walked in with. It was better than both. On the drive back to Chicago, Ethan called Emily's phone from the front seat of his car while she was in a separate vehicle heading home. "Tell my mother thank you," he said. "Tell her yourself," Emily said. "She reads lips better than you think." There was a pause, then a quiet laugh. "Yeah," he said. "I'm starting to figure that out." The town was called Mill Haven. It sat in a quiet corner of eastern Ohio, the kind of place that had probably looked almost exactly the same for 50 years. A main street with a hardware store, a diner with a hand-painted sign, a church with a parking lot that doubled as a farmer's market on Saturday mornings. The kind of town that people from cities drove through and barely registered. Margaret had lived here for 7 years before moving to Chicago. She'd asked Ethan to arrange the trip in early November, and he had, with minimal questions, which Emily was beginning to understand was one of the ways Ethan showed trust. He didn't always make things easy, but when he decided to give someone his confidence, he did it fully. A small convoy of 3 cars made the drive on a Friday morning. Ethan and Ryan together at the front, Patricia and James behind them, Emily and Margaret in the third car, with a driver Margaret had requested specifically, an older man named Lou, who had worked for the family for years and drove in comfortable silence. Margaret spent most of the drive looking out the window. Every so often she'd sign something to Emily, a memory sparked by a passing landscape, a detail she wanted Emily to understand before they arrived. Emily listened and stored it carefully, knowing there would be a moment when it mattered. They pulled into Mill Haven just before noon. The first stop was a residential street about 4 blocks from the main road. The houses were small and close together, well kept but modest. Lou slowed the car in front of a pale yellow house with a white porch, and Margaret leaned forward slightly in her seat. She signed without taking her eyes off the house. "This is where we started. Your grandfather and I rented the upstairs apartment for 3 years. We had nothing when we moved here, less than nothing. We had debt from a failed business he'd tried to run in Michigan. We came here because the rent was cheap and he had a contact who could get him work." Emily relayed this quietly to the others who had gathered on the sidewalk. Ryan looked at the house. "Dad never talked about Michigan." He was ashamed, Margaret signed. He felt he'd failed before he'd really begun. But coming here was the best thing that happened to us, because it forced him to slow down and think carefully instead of moving fast. Everything he built later came from lessons he learned by losing first. She tapped Emily's arm and pointed down the street. "Keep going. There's more." The second stop was a small commercial building on the edge of town, now occupied by a bookkeeping firm, but still carrying the faint ghost of a previous sign above the door. If you looked closely, you could make out the shape of letters that had been painted over. Margaret pointed at it and signed. That was his first real office. He rented a single room in that building for 4 years. I used to bring him lunch because we couldn't afford for him to eat out. We had Ethan by then, and Ryan was on the way. There were months where I genuinely did not know how we were going to manage. James, who had been fairly quiet all morning, spoke up. "I always assumed the family was comfortable from the beginning. Grandpa always seemed so established." "He became established," Margaret signed, and Emily translated. "That's different from starting that way. He worked 6 days a week for 11 years before the business reached a point where he felt he could breathe.
You never saw those 11 years, because by the time you were old enough to notice anything, they were already behind us. Patricia had her hand over her mouth slightly. He never said, she said quietly. All those years at family dinners, he never once said it was hard. He didn't want you to worry, Margaret signed. That was his way. Mine too, for a long time. We thought protecting people from difficulty meant not talking about it.
It took us a long time to understand that keeping everything smooth on the surface just meant the difficulty had nowhere to go. The diner on the main street was still there, and still had the same name, Patty's, in faded blue letters. They took up 2 tables for lunch, and the woman behind the counter, who looked to be in her 70s, recognized Margaret immediately and came out from behind the counter to hold both her hands and speak to her in the warm, slightly too loud way that people sometimes used with those they didn't realize could hear perfectly well. Margaret bore it graciously. Over lunch, Ethan was quieter than usual. Emily noticed him turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the table, which she'd come to recognize as what he did when he was thinking through something he hadn't worked out yet. Eventually, he said, to nobody in particular, I spent a lot of years being frustrated that he never explained his decisions, why he chose certain investments, why he walked away from certain deals. I thought he was keeping me out on purpose. He looked at Margaret. He just didn't know how to talk about the hard parts, did he? It wasn't really a question. Margaret reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly. Then she signed. Emily translated softly. She says he talked about you constantly. To her, to anyone who would listen. He just didn't know how to talk to you directly. She says you're more alike than you ever let yourself believe. Ethan nodded once, slowly. Ryan reached over and quietly refilled his brother's coffee without saying anything. It was a small gesture, but Emily caught Margaret noticing it, and the expression on Margaret's face in that moment was the closest thing to complete contentment Emily had ever seen on another person. The missing chapter wasn't missing anymore. It had just been waiting in a small Ohio town for someone to finally come and read it. Nobody in the family knew it was coming. That was the point. Margaret had been planning it for 6 weeks, working through Lou and through Ethan's assistant, a sharp, efficient woman named Dana, who had taken exactly 4 minutes to decide she adored Margaret and would help her with anything she asked. The invitations had gone out quietly. The community center on the west side of Chicago had been booked under a generic name. The catering had been arranged, and not one member of the Russo family had been told anything beyond, Margaret would like everyone together on Saturday afternoon. They assumed it was another family gathering, a meal, perhaps. Maybe another round of the kind of honest conversation that had become, slowly and somewhat surprisingly, a new feature of their time together. They walked into something else entirely. The community center's main hall had been arranged with round tables and good lighting, and when the family came through the doors, there were already 40 or so people inside. Men and women ranging from their 50s to their 80s, talking in small groups, holding drinks, wearing the particular expression of people who are happy to be somewhere and slightly emotional about why. Ethan stopped just inside the entrance. "Who are these people?" he said, not unpleasantly, just genuinely uncertain. Emily, who was the only one who'd been told anything, simply nodded toward Margaret, who was already moving through the room with Lou at her elbow, greeting people with handshakes and embraces, and the kind of warmth that needed no translation. "Old friends," Emily said. "Your family's history, apparently." The afternoon unfolded in a way that nobody could have planned better if they'd tried. A man named Walter, heavy-set, white-haired, with a handshake that meant business, had been Ethan and Ryan's father's first business partner in Chicago. He'd been at the company for 3 years before a health issue had forced him to step back, and the two men had stayed close until the father's death. Walter sat with Ethan for nearly an hour, and Emily stayed close enough to interpret when Margaret joined them, but far enough to give the conversation room. What Walter told Ethan was this. In the early years of the Chicago business, when things were still uncertain and the family was still finding its footing, Ethan, then 16, had apparently walked into the office one Saturday morning and spent 6 hours helping reorganize their paper filing system without being asked. The father had called Walter that evening and said, in Walter's recounting, "That boy is going to be fine. He just doesn't know it yet." Ethan listened to this with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way it got when he was trying not to show that something had landed. "He never told me that," Ethan said. Walter smiled. "He told everyone else." Ryan's afternoon took a different turn. A woman named Sylvia, trim, precise, with the energy of someone who had spent decades being the most organized person in every room she entered, introduced herself to Ryan as someone who had been a close friend of Margaret's during the years when the boys were teenagers. She'd moved to Seattle 20 years ago, and Margaret had tracked her down through a combination of determination and Dana's research skills. Sylvia sat with Ryan for a while, and what came out of that conversation shifted something in him, visibly. During Ryan's final year of high school, he'd gone through a period that the family had always referred to vaguely as a rough patch. Dropped grades, pulled back from friends, general withdrawal that everyone had noticed and nobody had addressed directly. Ryan had always assumed he'd navigated that period alone, because no one in the family had known how to reach him. Sylvia told him that wasn't true. "Your brother called me," she said. "He knew I was close to your mother, and he didn't know who else to ask. He was 17, and he was worried about you. And he had no idea what to do about it. We talked for almost 2 hours. Ryan went quiet. "Ethan called you." "He did. He wanted to know how to help you without making you feel worse. He was very careful about that. He kept saying he didn't want to embarrass you or make you feel like everyone was watching." Sylvia paused. "He asked me not to tell anyone. I kept that promise for a long time." Ryan looked across the room to where Ethan was still talking with Walter. He stayed looking for a moment. Then he stood up, crossed the room, waited for a natural pause in Ethan's conversation, and said simply, "Sylvia told me about the phone call." Ethan looked at him. Something passed between them that Emily couldn't read from where she was standing, and didn't need to. Ryan put his hand briefly on his brother's shoulder. Ethan nodded once. That was all. But it was enough, and anyone watching could see it was more than enough. Margaret found Emily near the end of the afternoon, when the energy in the room had softened into the comfortable warmth of people who had been talking for hours and weren't quite ready to leave. She signed, slowly, clearly, the way she did when she wanted to make sure every word carried. When people only know each other inside the family, they forget who they were before. These people remember the early versions, the ones who were still becoming something. I wanted my next generation to see those versions. Emily considered that for a moment. "Did it work?" she signed. Margaret looked around the room, at Ethan, at Ryan, at Patricia laughing with a woman she'd just met 2 hours ago, at James, listening carefully to an old man with a lot of stories left to tell. She signed one word back. Yes. The idea started with Margaret, as most things did. It came through in a signed conversation with Emily on a quiet Wednesday afternoon in early December, when the two of them had fallen into the habit of meeting for coffee at a small place near Emily's apartment, a routine that had developed gradually over the past few months, without either of them formally deciding on it. Margaret would arrive with Lou, order tea, and they would talk. Sometimes about the family, sometimes about nothing in particular. Emily had stopped thinking of it as part of any arrangement. It had simply become something she looked forward to. Margaret had been watching the news on her phone before Emily arrived, and she signed her first thought before Emily had even taken her coat off. "There's a community garden on the west side that's been abandoned for 2 years. The neighborhood association has been trying to restore it, but they don't have enough people or resources." Emily sat down and wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "And you're thinking the family should help?" she signed. Margaret's expression was the picture of innocence. "I'm thinking the family has more combined skills than they've ever used, in the same direction, at the same time." Emily looked at her for a moment. "You've already planned this, haven't you?" Margaret picked up her tea. By the following week, it had a name. The family called it The Project, capital P, in the way that things get named when everyone knows exactly what you mean without needing specifics. Ethan had made 3 calls and arranged permissions and materials. Ryan, who had done a landscaping business one summer in college and never entirely lost the interest, had driven out to the site and come back with a written assessment and a hand-drawn layout that Kara had digitized and turned into something presentable. Patricia, who taught art at a community college and had more organizational energy than most people half her age, had contacted the neighborhood association and set up a working schedule. James, to everyone's mild surprise, turned out to have significant experience with irrigation systems from a period of his life he'd apparently never mentioned at family gatherings. "You installed irrigation systems?" Ryan said when this came out during the planning meeting. "For 4 years," James said evenly. "Before the finance work. People don't ask." Ryan looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the ceiling briefly. "People don't ask," he repeated, more to himself than anyone. Emily caught Margaret's expression from across the room. It said, "This is exactly what I meant." They started on a Saturday morning in mid-December, which was not ideal weather for outdoor work in Illinois, but Margaret had pointed out, through Emily, that waiting for ideal conditions was how the garden had ended up abandoned in the first place. It was cold, the ground was hard at the edges and soft in the wrong places in the middle. Someone had brought a thermos of coffee that ran out within the first hour. The neighborhood association sent 3 of their members to help, including a retired schoolteacher named B, who had strong opinions about where the raised beds should go and was not shy about sharing them. What happened over the following 3 Saturdays was something Emily found difficult to describe when she tried to explain it later. These were people who, 4 months ago, had been sitting around a restaurant table, not listening to each other, who had carried decades of misread moments and undelivered letters and assumptions that had calcified into something that felt like fact. And here they were, in a community garden in December, arguing cheerfully about soil composition and making each other laugh and getting dirt on expensive coats without seeming to care. Ethan, who spent his professional life in boardrooms and on phones, turned out to be genuinely good with his hands. He built 2 of the raised bed frames himself over the first weekend and came back the following Saturday with better tools. Ryan directed the layout with a calm, easy confidence that Emily hadn't seen from him in any business setting. Kara managed the supply runs and kept everyone fed. Patricia painted a mural on the boundary wall with 2 teenagers from the neighborhood who had wandered over to watch and ended up staying all afternoon. James fixed the irrigation. Margaret supervised from a folding chair with a blanket over her lap, signing observations and instructions to Emily, who relayed them to whoever needed them. At one point, B asked who the silver-haired woman in the chair was, and Emily said she was the one who'd started all of this. B looked at Margaret for a moment, then walked over and introduced herself, speaking at a normal pace and waiting after each sentence with the natural ease of someone who simply adjusted to whoever she was talking to. Margaret responded through Emily, but kept her eyes on B the whole time, which B seemed to appreciate. By the 3rd Saturday, the garden was taking real shape. The beds were built and filled, the irrigation was running, the mural was nearly complete, something bright and layered that Patricia said was about growth, though it also looked, depending on the angle, like a family portrait done in abstract color. On the drive back from the final Saturday session, Emily and Margaret rode together again with Lou. It was dark by 4:30 and the city lights were coming on, and Emily was tired in the specific good way that comes from physical work and fresh air. Margaret signed without looking away from the window. "Did you notice what happened today?" Emily thought about it. "They stopped performing for each other," she signed back. "They were just working." Margaret turned from the window and looked at Emily directly. "That's it," she signed. That's the whole thing. People show each other who they are when they're working towards something, not when they're sitting around talking about who they are. Emily looked out at the passing city. She didn't have anything to add to that. Sometimes Margaret said something, and the only right response was to let it sit. The invitation this time came from Ethan, which surprised everyone, because Margaret had been the one orchestrating gatherings for months now, and the family had grown used to her being the quiet engine behind any occasion that turned out to matter. But this one came through Ethan directly, a message to each family member, simple and without much detail, asking them to come to the estate on a Saturday evening in late January for a family dinner. What the message didn't mention was that it had been Margaret's idea, and Ethan had simply been the one to send it. He'd told Emily this when he called to ask if she'd come, and she'd heard something in his voice that was different from the careful, measured tone he usually carried. He sounded, she thought, like someone who had been holding something for a long time and was finally ready to put it somewhere safe. Emily arrived at the estate at 6. The Russo estate in winter was a different thing from what she'd imagined in warmer months. The long driveway was lined with bare trees that looked skeletal against a pale sky, and the house itself, a large stone structure set back from the road with wide steps and tall windows, had a stillness to it that felt earned rather than empty, like a house that had absorbed a great deal of living over the years and had settled into itself because of it. Inside was warm and smelled of something good coming from the kitchen. The family filtered in over the next 30 minutes. Ryan and Cara arrived together, Cara carrying a bottle of wine, and Ryan carrying the slightly distracted energy of a man who had something on his mind. Patricia came with James, and the two of them were mid-conversation about something when they came through the door and finished it in the hallway before joining everyone else. A small detail, Emily thought, but the kind of small detail that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago, when the family occupied the same spaces with such careful, managed distance. Margaret was already seated in the living room when everyone gathered, her chair positioned slightly forward from the others in a way that was subtle but clear. She was dressed well, deep green, pearl earrings, her silver hair arranged neatly. She looked, Emily thought, like someone who had decided that this evening was worth dressing for. Dinner came first. It was good food and easy conversation, and Emily ate quietly and watched the table the way she'd been watching this family for months now. The dynamic had genuinely shifted, not completely. Families didn't work that way, and she'd stopped expecting them to. But the quality of the attention people paid each other had changed. Ryan and Ethan talked without the invisible fence that used to run between them. Patricia and James contributed to conversations without the slight tentativeness they used to carry. Cara, who had always been warm but somewhat carefully positioned on the edges of family dynamics, laughed fully and often. After dinner, when the plates had been cleared and everyone had moved back to the living room with drinks and the low light of the lamps, Margaret gestured to Emily. Emily set down her glass and moved to sit beside her. Margaret's hands began to move. Slowly and deliberately, the way they did when every word had been considered in advance. Emily translated in real time, her voice quiet and steady. She wants to say something she's been thinking about for a long time. She asks that everyone just listens first. The room settled. She says, "A family does not stay strong because people avoid disagreements. It stays strong because people continue listening even when they disagree." She's watched this family for a long time. She watched the distances grow between people she loved, and she couldn't always find a way to close them. She spent years writing letters nobody read and signing words nobody understood, and she wants to be honest about something. Emily paused, following Margaret's hands carefully. She says she wasn't only frustrated with the family. She was frustrated with herself, because she spent too long assuming that if she couldn't make herself heard easily, it wasn't worth the effort of trying. She let things go unsaid that should have been said, and she wants to ask forgiveness for that. The room was very still. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Ryan looked at his hands. Margaret continued. She says she's not ending on that, because that's not the point. The point is that every person in this room changed something this year, not because she asked them to, but because they decided to. Ethan reached across something that had been between him and Ryan for 20 years. Ryan let it be reached. Patricia drove 4 hours to Ohio without complaining once. James fixed an irrigation system in December without being asked twice. And Kara— Margaret looked directly at Kara when Emily said her name. She says Kara has loved this family with more generosity than most of them deserved when she first arrived, and she wants that said out loud. Kara pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling briefly. Then Margaret signed something, and Emily felt the weight of it before she translated it. She says, "You don't need me to interpret for you anymore. You've learned to slow down enough to listen." That was all it ever took. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Ryan said, "That's not entirely true. Some of us are still working on it." A few people laughed, quietly but genuinely. Ethan stood up from his chair, crossed the room, and crouched down in front of his mother's chair so he was at her eye level. He signed something to her, slowly, imperfectly, clearly someone who had been practicing but was not yet fluent. Emily saw what he signed. She didn't translate it.
That one was just for Margaret. But Margaret's face said everything. 1 year changes more than most people expect. Emily had thought about this on the drive up to the lakeside resort on a Friday afternoon in late January, watching the winter landscape flatten out along the highway and thinking about where she'd been sitting exactly 14 months ago. A Saturday night shift, table 12, a family that couldn't hear each other, and a woman whose hands were moving in a room full of people who weren't looking. It was strange how quietly a life could turn. She'd kept her job at the restaurant. She still worked the Saturday evening shift, still knew which tables needed extra attention and which guests wanted to be left alone. Her regular life had continued in all the ways regular lives do. Bills, groceries, the ongoing project of her apartment, phone calls with her sister that ran long and covered everything. But something had threaded itself into the fabric of the past year that hadn't been there before, and she was still working out exactly what to call it. Lou picked her up from the highway exit in the same quiet, reliable way he did everything, and they made the last 20 minutes of the drive in comfortable silence. The resort sat at the edge of a frozen lake, which in January meant a particular kind of beauty, stark and clean, the ice carrying a pale blue light that shifted as the afternoon moved toward evening. The main building was warm inside, wood-paneled and well-heated, with large windows that faced the water. Someone had already arranged a long table near those windows, and by the time Emily arrived, half the family was already there. Ryan spotted her first and waved from across the room. That small thing, the ease of it, the lack of any awkwardness, still surprised her sometimes. A year ago, Ryan Russo had been someone she'd observed carefully from the professional distance of a waitress who knew better than to read too much into a table. Now he was someone who saved her a seat without being asked. She sat down. Kara poured her a glass of something warm without asking whether she wanted it, which was exactly right. Margaret arrived 20 minutes later with Ethan, and the room shifted in the way it always did when she entered. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. People turned. Conversations paused and reoriented. Not out of obligation, Emily had come to understand, but out of genuine attention. The family had learned, over the past year, that Margaret was usually the most interesting person to watch in any room she occupied, and they'd stopped pretending otherwise. She looked well. Better than well, actually. There was something in how she carried herself this January
that had been more effortful a year ago. A kind of ease that comes not from things getting simpler, but from a person finally deciding to stop carrying weight they were never meant to carry alone. She found Emily almost immediately and signed across the room. "You look tired. Did you work last night?" Emily smiled. "Double shift. Worth it." Margaret's expression communicated what she thought of double shifts on the eve of a family gathering, and Emily laughed before she could explain herself. Dinner was long and unhurried, the way the best meals are. What struck Emily, sitting in the middle of it, was the sound of the room. Not what was being said, though that was good too, easy and warm and occasionally very funny, but the texture of the sound itself. It was full. People talking over each other slightly, correcting each other's memories of things, laughing at stories that apparently got better every time they were told. The kind of noise a family makes when it has stopped being careful. And woven through all of it, something new. Several times during dinner, without any announcement or self-consciousness, family members signed directly to Margaret. Not perfectly. Ryan's signing was improving, but still carried the effortful quality of someone who was working at it, but consistently. Ethan, who had apparently been practicing with more focus than anyone had realized, held a full exchange with his mother over the soup course that lasted several minutes and required no interpretation at all. Patricia had taken a beginner's class in the fall and brought it up casually, the way you mention something that has simply become part of how you spend your time. James had downloaded an app and was, by his own admission, nowhere near conversational, but could follow simple exchanges if people signed clearly. Cara, who had the natural facility for language that some people carry without working for it, was already the most fluent of the group after Margaret. Emily found herself, for stretches of the evening, simply watching rather than interpreting. Her hands were still when they'd spent the better part of a year in motion, and the stillness felt significant in a way she couldn't entirely articulate. She wasn't unnecessary. There were still moments during the evening when Margaret signed something layered or quick, and a look came her way for help. But those moments were fewer and further between than they'd ever been. The table had learned to slow down. After dinner, when people had pushed their chairs back and the lake outside had gone fully dark, and the room had settled into the kind of warmth that follows a good meal among people who are glad to be together, Margaret tapped the table once for attention. She signed something, simple and clear and deliberate. The family, all of them, read it directly. Emily read it too. She didn't translate it aloud. She didn't need to. But what Margaret had signed was this: "The greatest thing you ever gave me was not learning my language. It was learning to wait long enough to hear what I was saying." The table held that for a moment. Then Ryan raised his glass, and everyone followed, and the conversation picked up again, louder and warmer and more alive than before. Emily looked at Margaret across the table. Margaret looked back at her with an expression that needed no translation in any language. Some things, it turned out, were always perfectly clear. They just required someone willing to pay attention.